So you're on live, so mind your P's and Q's. Welcome to this really, really important first workshop on a big piece of decision making. It's lovely music in the background, isn't it? Hopefully it lasts. Welcome. Same as all other workshops, we'll get a presentation from the team, and then we'll have some questions. Do you want questions through or at the end?
On this one, I think we can probably try and take questions through, and I might, if that starts to get too much, I'm quite happy to suddenly tell you, no, we're going to have to delay this again. But we've got 2 hours, I think it'll be extra time.
Stuart, so I'll introduce him in a moment.
Yeah,
if you want.
okay.
Sorry, unless that's not what you want.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Just welcome to Stuart from Morrison Lowe, who's been a part of the report that hopefully you've all read. Right, welcome. Erin, do you want to frame it up?
I will. There's probably a few things that I just wanted to say before we kick into the work that Andrew and Stuart pulled together. One of the first things is that it seems like we've been talking about local water done well, or how we're going to deal with Three Waters, for a really long time. So in a lot of ways it feels like we've been on the roller coaster forever. But what I wanted, I guess, to say is that this workshop is actually a really different opportunity to what we've had previously. Previously, we've generally been talking about what's happening in the world around us. This time it's actually about, we've gotten to the point in the process where Invercargill City Council now has to make some decisions about what is the right thing to do for Three Waters going forward. So very much the ball comes back into the council's hands. Now, we are still working within an increasingly regulated industry, so there are factors that are changing, and in some ways the goalposts are keeping moving for us. And we've also up against some mandated timeframes that are pretty tight on council around how quickly it needs to run through this process to come to a decision around what's the best way that council wants to deal with Three Waters moving into the future, that informs those water service delivery plans that we have to submit next year, which I'll get Andrew to talk through in a little bit more detail in a moment. One of the key things I want to talk about is, as much as I know we all love just jumping into making the decision, I did want to put us through a little bit of a process around this one. And that's because I think this is going to be something that people are going to have different opinions on outside of the council chamber. And so any process that's likely to come under scrutiny, criticism, people thinking it should have been done differently or different choices made, I think the first thing we always want to do is come up with what are we trying to achieve out of the options that we are potentially looking at. And I think what I'd say is that's been really important around the museum process, the fact that we could constantly go back to those pillars and what did we want to achieve and are we staying true to that has been really important. And I want to make sure that we're able to do that with this process as well, particularly given the implementation of whatever we do is likely to span across an election period as well. And we may have new faces at the table before we've completed this journey. So I don't want us to have to spend ages on that, but I do want to make sure that we're very clear as a group what council wants to achieve out of Three Waters moving forward. The other piece that I would note is that before we get to workshop 2, I'm also bringing in an independent expert, particularly to have a look at how we operate water supply in the city. That's the area that's becoming, I guess, the regulations really tightening up for us. And I want to make sure that we've got an independent view of how well placed we are to meet those requirements moving forward. And I think it's always good to test ourselves. We've got a great team, but it's always good to have a different view of how that's going. And I want to make sure that council has got as much information from different sources as possible to be able to make the decision that's ahead of it. So to that end, Andrew, can we get you to click through to the first slide?
So just on that though, because I think that is really important around the, what are we trying to achieve here? What are the high level sort of principles we're trying to reach for?
Yeah.
So How?
So Stuart's going to run us through a bit of a process
Cool.
of how we're going to come up with those as a group.
Okay, great.
We're not moving. Michelle,
Was working.
can I get you to move us forward? Thank you. And through to the next one. Okay. So as I've noted, we're obviously working in that a little bit uncertain environment where Bill 3 for water services has not been released yet. We're expecting to see our first look at that in December, with that to become legislation next year. But that's essentially where we think we've got a bit of an idea of the path ahead around what Three Waters regulation is going to look like, what the economic regulator is going to look like, but there's still quite a few unknowns for us in that space. We put up that overarching plan in September around how we're going to navigate through the next few months to the point where we need to go out to public consultation on what we want to do moving forward, and then take that through to those water service delivery plans that we need to submit next year. And also, we want to just keep in context the work that's being done, more broadly across the region. We're not the only ones who are on this similar journey at the moment, and we obviously have been doing some work with Otago Southland as well. Can we get the next slide? I think I've spoken through the majority of that. Andrew, can I just get you to talk through the workshop layout between now and the end of the year?
Sure thing. Yep. Okay, so in terms of approach, so this workshop talked about the fact that we're adopting the Better Business Case methodology. In this workshop, Stu's going to be running us through the current state, looking for us to come up with some investment objectives that we'll use to assess the options that are on the table, and ideally refine those options down as much as possible. But that's we don't want to push ourselves too far, but seeing what we're all comfortable with. The next workshop is where we'll take that information away and do a lot of financial and non-financial analysis on the options, weigh those against the investment objectives, and then bring that information back to the forum to say, of those options that have been laid out on the table, here's the information assessment against each, so that we can look at each and disparately and dispassionately, and see what are the relative merits and drawbacks for each. Ultimately, we've got to drive towards a decision to which of the collaborations we're going to take out for consultation. So the aim of workshop 3 would be to nail that down almost as much as possible, that we do have the ability to take that through. The ultimate decision for options to take to consultation is by the end of January, and so that aligns with the annual plan decision timeframes. 2 questions.
Yep. Mayor Clark.
I understand in the webinar that I had with DIA that the deadline for feeding back to them is actually Christmas, not January.
So there hasn't been a explicit requirement stated out through the teams to deliver to that.
Sorry, I think
What
Mayor
was the
Clark
question?
may be referring to the requirement for us to submit our data through to them from our long-term plans, and then they've done that assessment already of our data and sent that back to us.
That was
so
optional.
Yeah.
The question for Mayor Clark was: do we have to? Is there a requirement to communicate to the DIA which of the options we're taking out for consultation? And there hasn't been anything that's stated. I guess there's the ability through the checkpoints, the regular checkpoints, to keep them appraised of progress, but there hasn't been a time frame communicated to us.
Through you, Chair. At that webinar, which was driven by DIA, they said there were 4 steps in the process leading us up to the water services plan by September next year. Step 1 was for us to consider our long-term plan in relation to Three Waters, our asset management plans going forward, and also our financial position. And then we were to give them an overview by Christmas. They said that specifically by Christmas we would prefer that Step 2 is for us to then decide which 2 options do we take out for consultation, and when are we going to do that consultation. And it seems like most of the councils are talking about February or March for consultation. But I just don't want us to miss that deadline.
So we'll check if there's anything that we've missed. We've already given basically our full long-term plan data through to DIA, and they've already made an assessment of that and provided it back to us, but we'll just double check that there's not something that we still need to provide them.
Trish?
Through you, Chair, would it be possible to have the documentation and sent to us in board books so we could look at it before the next workshop?
This information that's being presented here?
No,
The
you
spreadsheet?
said, sorry, that you were going to collate it and put it together and then come back and discuss it.
Yep.
I personally would like to be able to read that before I come to the workshop, if that's possible.
That doesn't sound unreasonable.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a fair
Sorry, can I
request.
just be clear on what information are we talking about that we would collate? Sorry.
So I think it's
I missed
the
that.
information that comes out of here, so the notes effectively, or the meeting notes. Is that what you're talking about, Trish?
Yeah, what I was meaning here is whatever is on the agenda for the workshop for the next workshop.
In
If
December.
we could have it on board book so that we could come prepared as much as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So we'll look to share that, ahead of the workshop.
Thank you very much.
Okay, that's no worries. So, Andrew, was there anything you wanted to draw attention to before I just introduce Stuart?
No, in terms of the ultimate output, June 25 at the earliest is when we're looking to have our water services delivery plan defined and agreed. There's some contingency around that. 3 September is the cut-off date, but we're trying to front-load this as much as possible.
And I think the key piece there is, as well, as we want to make sure we don't get too close to the elections where council essentially goes into administration mode as well. So we want to leave plenty of time.
So through you, Chair, just to signal that I think certainly the mayors in the southern region have already written off to several ministers to say the time framing for this is not ideal. So how do you make decisions about this issue, local water done well, when we don't have the specs that we have to deliver for wastewater, for
Yeah,
example,
that's exactly right. Yeah.
which could significantly increase, maybe 8 or 10-fold what we have to pay. And so myself and the other mayors have written away in the last couple of days saying, look, the time framing for this one is a problem. That we're going a little bit blind until we know what those national standards are going to be and how we can deliver that as well. So just signalling, it's not to say we shouldn't get on and get it done, but
And I think we've signalled that both at a staff level through DIA, and I understand Michael's also signalled that directly with the Minister as well. We're getting a little bit of mixed views as to whether or not we've got any wiggle room around that or not, but definitely there was a meeting that we had as staff with the DIA about 2 weeks ago where they told us the likelihood of getting extensions was pretty slim, although I understand Michael may have gotten a little bit more positive message. So
I think the push from the mayors will, collectively from the mayors, will be that the deadline should not be September 25,
Yeah.
it should be September 26.
yeah. And then I guess the final piece that I wanted to add to that was no matter, and I think Stu will probably talk about this as well, no matter which way we cut how we might deliver Three Waters, it's going to be a bit of a tough road ahead. The regulations are increasing, the cost is therefore increasing, and council's going to come into a space where it's going to have increasing regulation around the decisions that it has to make and how it's able to balance the funds that council has available both for Three Waters as well as for the other obligations that council has to communities as well. And so I think when we go into the context of this one, we need to keep that front of mind, that it's not going to be the easiest journey ahead for us. We are in a much better place, I think Stu will take us through, than a number of other councils in our region, but that doesn't mean that we don't have our own challenges as well, both in terms of how we finance what we do going forward as well as how we resource it with the right staff to get done what we want to do. So to that end, I will hand over to Stu. Stu's also been involved in the work for Otago Southland as part of Morrison Low, and so we have used him here for this work as well because he was able to very quickly get up to speed with the Invercargill position, already having all of our data. So over to you, Stu. And flick ahead, Michelle.
No, we'll come back to that maybe at the end if we've got time. Next slide, please. Sorry. Yep. So I guess before I get into the workshop approach, for those of you that haven't met me, and I think that's probably quite a number of you, I'm Stu. I'm an Associate Director at Morrison Low, and I've been involved in Three Waters work for 7 or 8 years now. I hate to try and count. Starting off with doing some work for DIA before they'd formalised what they were looking like they were going to do for the Three Waters Reform Programme, then doing work for the Hawke's Bay councils in terms of their preferred model, and then we started doing some work for the Otago and Southland group 3 or 4 years ago, just at the time when the government was also kicking off their Three Waters program and starting to think about whether it was opt-in, opt-out, compulsory, whatever all those arrangements were, and it all got a little bit messy then. And then we were advisors to LGNZ for the Three Waters work as well for a while. So I've been involved in this for a while. I like to suggest that I suspect I'll still be involved in it for another 7 or 8 years, which just shows how much of a skeptic I've become about this, but also just how difficult some of the decisions are around Three Waters. And I like to talk about Three Waters as being one of the most important, the drinking water and the health of our waterways is some of the most important things for our residents and for our economy. So really critical, and that's what makes it really, really difficult for people to make decisions around where that should be managed and how that should be managed. And obviously the previous government's reform program maybe seeded a whole pile of distrust there as well. So we've got a way to go. So today, I think Erin's kind of covered broadly what I want to do, but I want to take us through, I'll touch on the regional work overview and a bit about just local water done well in general, the national program that we have to respond to. But then I want to go into the local context a bit more around what is important in Invercargill, what makes Invercargill different to Otago and Southland, why are we a district that we might want to think about what's important to us as a city, rather than what is important to Otago and Southland, and how we can use that to help make our decisions when we move forward. And so we're going to have a bit of a discussion about what makes Invercargill great. I just want some feedback from you around what makes Invercargill great there. And then I've got a bit of an exercise, an interactive poll, where I want you guys just to highlight to me what you think is important for the future of Three Waters services delivery in Invercargill again. So all my questions to you are about Invercargill, not about the region or the even broader region or New Zealand. It's Invercargill is what we wanted to capture here, right?
And Bluff.
Well, okay, yeah, and Bluff. The area that you service, the area that your council services is what we're concerned about.
Is that title, that discussion, a point to the recent outcome of the election in America?
No, it's not.
Okay. Meg.
Yeah, no, but it was very coincidental. I think I might have written this before I knew the outcome to the election, but
Right. Just checking.
yeah. So leave your MAGA hats at home for that conversation potentially. And then we'll have a short break just because once we get that information from you about what's important, we need to use that to come up with what the strategic objectives might look like. And I'll be honest, we've had a conversation with staff around what we think that might look like. But that break will give us some time to refine it. There's no way we would have been able to write investment objectives in 10 minutes following your feedback, so we have had to kind of guess what that might look like first, and then we'll tweak those if we need to during that break, so once we have a little bit of a chance to have a look. And then finally, I just want to take you through the long list of options that are available to you, and hopefully what I want to just get out of that conversation is what's the stuff I can just draw a big red line through, and that we don't really need to consider for very much longer. If I am drawing a big red line through it though, I would like to also be able to capture from you why I'm drawing a big red line through it. And that's really what I want to cover off today, and then I think at the very end there might be a little bit of a wrap up around what are the next steps that I think Erin and Andrew might take us through as well. So Moving on to the first slide, please. I think this, from what I understand, this clicker is a little bit challenging. So local water done well, and Erin's touched on some of this, but these are just one of the key deliverables at the end of this local water done well program is a water service delivery plan. And I just wanted to touch again on what a water services delivery plan must actually include, and these are effectively the minimum requirements. In some cases there are requirements where you can go further. But they have to be provided to DIA by the 3rd of September unless we get an extension. And they must cover at least 10 years. DIA have given us the option to make them cover 30 years. My suggestion is that as a council you should at least look at a 30-year plan. Whether that's what you submit or whether you submit a 10-year plan is up to you, but it would be sensible for you to look at 30 years because a lot of infrastructure issues don't emerge in a 10-year period. It must demonstrate compliance with current and future regulatory requirements, and obviously Mayor Clark kind of touched on what some of that challenge might be, is that we don't know what the future regulatory requirements are, and just to add to that frustration, you know, those future regulatory requirements, some of them we will know in February or March next year. So really frustrating in terms of the timing, because in February and March next year we'll have a good steer on what that looks like, but we would have had to have done a reasonable amount of work and a reasonable amount of decision making before we actually know what that looks like.
But it isn't, I mean, that's crazy, isn't it? How do you...
That's the simple answer.
But the guiding principle there would be, you know, those regulations will fall down on some principles, which is around safe drinking water, environmental, you know, impact on wastewater, you know, low or no, and then that's probably the two, isn't it?
Yeah, and we can touch
And
on what
probably
we think some of
affordability.
those are going to look like, but yeah, I mean, to some extent, you can only anticipate what you can anticipate. So,
That's right.
You're exactly right. I mean, it's going to be around drinking water and it's going to be around wastewater.
Yeah.
Drinking water is probably not going to change very much in terms of the requirements you need to meet, and particularly for your council, which typically has large supplies.
Yeah.
So,
Well, the only other thing within drinking water would probably be resilience, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
By second alternative water source.
yeah, and this is the challenge as well, is that when we talk about compliance with current and future regulatory requirements, it's really easy to think of what Taumata ROI might set or what the regional council might set, although the regional council's power is going to diminish through these reform programs. But the other big one is what the economic regulator is going to require, and that's where maybe resilience is going to become more important, is actually from the economic regulator rather than through the Taumata ROI, the performance regulator. And what we might also see in the future from an economic regulator is minimum service performance requirements and things like that. So there might be expectations of either the age of your network to decrease over time, or there might be expectations that we have less water loss than we currently do, or you know, there might be a minimum threshold for water loss in different districts. So there will be some requirements around that we don't know yet, but they'll be around network performance, and they'll be what might be driving a lot of investment. If it's not standards, it might be that we need to replace our pipes because they're too leaky, or that they're too old for what the regulator is looking for. So there are some things we don't quite know, and we can take some hints from what DIA is asking for us to disclose in water service delivery plans, but that is really just the beginning and the tip of the iceberg. That economic regulator doesn't even know what it's doing yet.
So when you say the regional body will step back from regulation, is that because some of those standards will come directly into the provider?
Yeah, so particularly in the wastewater space, I've got a slide that touches on this anyhow,
Right,
but particularly in the wastewater space, where I think we'll see a shift away from the regional discretion that's maybe allowed at the moment for regional councils.
Come back direct, Tom?
So, quick question, Stu. Current and future, when do you think the standards that are proposed, maybe in March, when we start to get a look at what those might look like, when do you think they would become current? In other words, how long before you could see actually becoming regulation?
I think Mayor Clark might, is that a response?
Yeah, I can help with that. The regulator's going to put them out in March. It goes to the minister by May, but it needs to be captured with the Water Services Bill number 3, which looks like the end of next year.
End
Or
of
end of next year or early the following year, that that'll be actually enacted.
Hence the request of the mayors to sort of leap over that and go to the sort of
Yep.
26.
This is the dilemma we face.
Yeah.
And presumably, sorry for you, Chair, presumably the risk is that as we develop a plan that can deal with the current one, which is fairly simple to do, I guess, when we look at future regulation, if we base it on what comes out in March, we don't know the extent to which that might be modified as it goes through the regulation process.
Absolutely. So that's good. That's going to be a set of draft standards that my understanding, and listening to Alan Bragnall, the CEO of Taumata ROI, it sounds like they're working at pace, which to me would suggest, and they are saying, well, we're not going to reinvent the whole world here. We know that there are standards used internationally that we might be able to pick up and use. But my guess would be that those, when they're coming out in draft in March, they may be very draft compared to what they end up looking like at the end. There's a whole consultation process that comes in after that.
So you're right, Stuart. I had a meeting last week with Alan as well, and he reinforced just what you've just said. Less discretion for regional councils, so more uniformity. Base standards, if you meet the base standards, you get the consent for whatever part of the network you need to have it for. At the moment, it seems to be a baseline, and then there's an encouragement to constantly enhance, and they said that's open to interpretation, so they're doing away with that. Pull out what you need to pull out. If you get the base standard, you get it. The other issue is what you talked about is network loss, and I can't find any politicians anywhere, including the government sector agencies, that will talk about water meters. They just don't want to go there.
Yeah.
And it's a logical conclusion that we should. Just got to compare us with Watercare in Auckland or with Central Otago, but they politically know it's an absolute hand grenade. So I think that if we wanted to go down that track, we'd have to initiate ourselves.
Yeah. So certainly, and I haven't spoken to Alan about water meters for some time, but I did speak to him about it, I think last year or something, and he said, oh, well, there's heaps of different ways that a water entity can bill, and you don't need to use water meters to bill. So they are very agnostic at best in terms of their messaging around water meters. I think you could look around the country at the places that have implemented them for cases as to why you might want to. But obviously that big fear of them being the first step towards privatisation has always been a political barrier, I think.
I think their nervousness is not the fact of you billing that way. That's controversial anyway. It's how do you deal with the losses in your system. Like we've got about 30%, they tell us. Wellington's close to 60%, so the logic tells you, why would you treat a volume of water knowing that as it gets through to wherever it's going, you lose 60% of it? Just madness.
Yep.
And the only way you stop that is water meters.
Yep.
They instantly tell you where you got your leaks.
Yep, absolutely. Yep, I'm fully on board with the principles of water metering. I completely agree with it. That's, I think, hopefully we can semi-park that decision around water meters when we look at water service delivery plans, but we do need to, in the water services delivery plan, actually explain how we are going to collect revenue and how we're going to treat revenue, so it can become a critical part of that conversation. I'm also aware of councils that have introduced water meters, and in their foyer they've got, example water meters, and they say, look at our new water loss detectors, I think is what they've called them instead. And that's how they've been used for quite a while before they start charging people anyhow. But there is, there's always opportunities to brand around what you call a water meter and how you deal with that. But moving back onto, I guess, my points around what we need in a water services delivery plan. So it also needs to demonstrate how growth will be provided for. Again, there's another bit there where we don't quite know what those future standards look like. Anyone who may have paid attention to Chris Bishop made an announcement around growth and providing for growth all of about 3 months ago, where they were talking about changing the national performance standard on urban development and requiring councils to have infrastructure enabled development capacity for 30 years and the removal of an urban rural boundary. that can have implications for a number of councils. I don't suspect it's going to have a major issue for Invercargill, but it may have some issues there. We also need to demonstrate financial sustainability by 30th of June 2028. So financial sustainability in terms of the water service delivery plan requirements is collecting enough revenue to cover your costs and your debt servicing effectively. There is no word in Bill 2 about, well, I don't even know if the word affordability appears once in Bill 2. If it does, it's certainly not in the context of financial sustainability in that way.
Tom?
Stu, when you say, I'm just trying to understand what's meant by 30th June 2028, does that mean that you have to be financially sustainable by 30th June 2028, or does it mean you have to demonstrate it? So I thought part of the what we had to submit by September next year included a financial sustainability section. Is that not the case?
Yeah, there is a financial sustainability section within the Water Services Delivery Plan.
Right.
What it's saying is that if you're not financially sustainable in 2026 and 2027, that's okay, but the 2028 financial year, you have to be financially sustainable. So it's allowing you a bit of time to get there, effectively, is all it's trying to say. So that plan will have to show that you're going to get there by that date, effectively. So,
And will the term financial sustainability, is that already defined?
it is defined, yeah. So that's the one that, like I say, talks about effectively revenue sufficiency. So enough money coming into the bank to cover your operating costs and your debt servicing. So nowhere in there does it say anything about affordability. But what I would say is that when you've got one of these plans, there's going to be a revenue line. And that revenue line is only coming from one place, because revenue in local government typically only ever comes from one place, which is our ratepayers. And so when you're looking at that, you are going to obviously, as elected members and representatives of your ratepayers, you are obviously going to be wanting to look at, well, what does that mean in terms of the impact on rates to support that financial sustainability line. And I think that's how government's got in the way with not having affordability in there, because they're saying we're just going to punt it to the elected members and make them make that decision and make that call. Yeah. Yeah, Clark.
So just on the issue of affordability, not financial sustainability, one of the issues that's come up, I guess, and it's relevant for Invercargill is, are we comparing apples with apples? So what I mean by that is that at the moment we've got a long-term plan in place that says this is what we're going to be doing in the Three Waters space, and we've got rates and other sources of revenue coming in to satisfy that. So our risk, I guess, or what we need to cover off is, has the landscape changed now for what we need to do going forward? Is it more than business as usual? And if it is, where does the revenue come from? Because one of the things that I would contend is that this council's done very well in maintaining its infrastructure, and our credit rating is very good, and we have a lot of headroom that other councils don't have, so we're in a much better financial position. But to me, it's not a matter of saying, well, Three Waters is going to cost us, I don't know, let's say $100 million over 10 years, when in fact we've already factored in 80 million of that. It's just, where does the other 20 million come from, and can we afford that without going into a CCO or going in with another arrangement? So having that differential would be quite helpful to have that.
So that's a piece of work that will be done as part of the option analysis, is to go and double check the numbers and be sure that we're adequately providing.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I note is that we're not quite aligned in terms of how we've funded depreciation. So that'll be one of the things that we'll need to standardise. That being said, Stu's already done some work around that for the Otago Southland model, which he'll show to you. But it means the numbers look slightly different to what they did in our long-term plan. There's also some other pieces of work that, because we were still coming off the back of the previous water entity model, we really focused on those key things around legislative compliance coming into this long-term plan. There's some other things that council may or may not have risk around, and what we want to do is just make sure we go through and we check all of those and go, is there a big enough risk here for council to need to act? And that's largely around if we get pulled into providing supply to anybody else that we don't currently do, and so we want to make sure that we pull any of those things out in as well, do some risk score exploring, bring that back to council as part of workshop 2 and go, is there any other changes that we should be making to that current financial outlook to make sure that we have as best a view as possible of what that financial obligation may be going forward, keeping in mind that the regulations are still in a bit of a state of flux.
Is one of the benefits of having it separated is that you can then set up an independent balance sheet and finance that balance sheet, which in my mind would then probably smooth the implications of cost. A 100-year asset, 90-year debt profile, that changes your debt profile quite considerably, whereas we sort of jumble everything into a debt profile that we don't even look at, I don't think.
I think, and Patricia may want to add something to this one, and I'm certainly no expert in operating a commercial entity. However, I think one of the key things that we struggle with as a council is, even though we debt fund our infrastructure investment over a period of time, to make sure that we've always keeping within those limits that council set around having enough headroom in terms of our debt capacity, we're having to pay down that debt a lot faster to make room for the next project that would come on board, which may not be an infrastructure project, it may be a project across another area of council, a roading project or something like that, which means that you're exactly right, we can't smooth that investment over the full period that we may otherwise do, because we're constantly having to make room for that push-pull of different areas and different priorities.
Yeah, so I think that to me allows a better look at how you actually finance, and it could impact positively affordability over the long term.
What I would say, though, is that one of the things, and we've got to do some more work around the financial models of it, is that at the moment council has obviously got the ability to pull some of that really big investment that we need to make in against Three Waters and keep under council's debt cap, because we're looking at the revenue that council brings in as a whole. If we ring fence that just into Three Waters, then we do struggle with that hitting that debt cap, because our Three Waters revenue is significantly smaller. So one of the things that one of the uncertainties, although we've had some indications, is whether or not the regulator will allow us from a commercial perspective to look at council's whole ability to fund debt, or whether or not it will restrict it simply to Three Waters income. Indications are that as long as you can fund your debt, they're fairly happy, but we just would like some greater clarity around that.
Which has uncovered the problem we've got. Right? We've borrowed money from this part of the thing and put it over here, and now that's broken down and we've got no money for it.
I think it's more around what we do.
Not us, I'm just saying across New Zealand.
We do, what we've done here is, for example, is we've tried to smooth our investment across the 10 years so that we don't have five projects at the same time. So what we do have, though, is that we'll have, for example, we'll use council's total sort of debt capacity to fund something like the museum. Then the next couple of years we'll look at funding something like alternative water. Then we'll fund something else. Then we'll fund Clifton, and so we expand that full debt headroom at different times across different areas of council.
And I think I'm also conscious that I think we're about 25 minutes on one slide, and there's about 15 or 16 that I've got to get through. Fortunately, I think we've got through the first 5, which are probably the meatiest points on the slide. The next ones are really administrative more than anything else, I guess. The plans can be submitted individually or as a joint plan. So if there is another council you are working with that you've decided you're going to actually go and explore a joint arrangement with, you can develop a plan together. I think even if you're doing a joint arrangement, doing a joint plan is probably a heck of a lot more work, actually. It almost reads as though it's meant to be a quicker process because there's 2 or 3 of you sharing resources. The reality is multiple councils working together is never quicker than one council doing it on its own, really. Those plans also must be accepted, so they go through a DIA review process. They are being reviewed by, I don't know if we exactly know who at DIA, but also some people at MB, and I would expect the Commerce Commission to be involved in the review as well. And they will have to review the plan and determine whether you are in fact meeting the requirements of it. And if you are not, then they will be asking you to do it again, and potentially they will be putting in person to do that for you at your cost. And then finally, as well, as part of developing that plan, we do have to consult on options. So we have to consult on 2 options as a minimum with our community. That consultation is on the service delivery arrangement, not necessarily the plan itself, as long as the plan reflects the service delivery arrangement that was consulted on. We don't need to consult on both. That consultation will include effectively the status quo, and I hesitate to use the word status quo because water service delivery will look different in any form in the future, and I'll touch on that shortly. But it needs to include that and either a CCO or a joint arrangement of some sort as an alternative option. That doesn't mean you have to go with the CCO at the end of it, but you need to consult on at least those kind of 2 options. And a CCO, again, I'll touch on what that might look like or what you might be able to consult on there. I thought I was changing my slide with my computer and then realised I'm not. Are we in the right one? Yep. So the future of Three Waters looks very different, and we've touched on a lot of this, so I'm going to try and skim through it as much as we can. But regulation and standards, this is some of the stuff we know might be coming, but we don't know everything that's coming, right? So we've got National Wastewater Environmental Performance Standards. I think that's what Mia Clark was just talking about, well, was touching on before, which is Taumata Arawai's approach. They've been directed to develop wastewater performance standards. Those standards have been instructed as being effectively the standard that applies across the country. So regional councils are not meant to be imposing conditions over and above what those standards are like. And Alan Pragnell's described it as almost a matrix. So you might have across the top that you've got receiving environments. You know, there might be 5 or 6 different types of receiving environments. And then down the side you might have different populations. And wherever you fit in that box, these are the treatment options, or these are the standards that you have to apply to be able to conform. Again, we don't know exactly what those standards look like, but there's also been a direction from the government. If we look at what those directions are implying, I think we can probably infer that a requirement to discharge to land is very unlikely to come out of those standards. And part of that is because obviously we've got a government that has stopped the notification of Otago Regional's Land and Water Plan, which was restrictive in working towards this. Do you want to speak now, Nobby?
Just to say that in the presentation that Alan did to the Otago South and Mayors about 2 weeks ago, he did actually have land discharge in the options.
Right.
And so I grilled him about that, and that's to say, look, they don't want a blanket discharge to land, which is where the last government was taking us, because the cost nationally was $40-50 billion. It was massive. But if a council elected to go to land because they didn't have a suitable water option, like for argument's sake, they don't have a fast-moving river, because the regulators talked about that as one of the options, ocean or fast water, which means if you've got a slow river or an estuary, you're going to have to look elsewhere. That it's still on the table, but it's there by choice. It's not going to be enforced.
Yeah, good point. That's absolutely right. They're not going to stop you from doing that if you have a choice, but they're certainly not likely to force it. So there will also be exceptions for small water schemes and standard solutions for small wastewater schemes. I don't think those are going to impact Invercargill City Council at all anyhow, but the wastewater schemes that serve fewer than 1,000 people.
Barry, did you have a question?
Yeah. If the system complies, are we going to be forced to alter it just because?
Sorry, I'm
Yeah,
conscious that we've
Yeah.
probably, this
What-
is probably a one that's a little bit better for us to deal with through our Bluff workshop
yeah.
on the 25th. I'm conscious
trying-
we've got a lot to get through
Not only talking about the block.
today. Oh, no, but we can talk about those, that's changing regulations piece. We'll be getting advice around that. It'll be specific to Bluff, but it'll also be around what's coming in that space as well. Just conscious, otherwise we won't
Yeah,
get
you're
through the
gonna-
decisions
yeah.
that you have to make today.
Yeah, that's right.
That's a good point. So there'll be some national engineering standards likely to be introduced. That would be fantastic. It means everyone will be operating to the same standards, hopefully, over time. At some point in my past life, I was involved in trying to set up Three Waters metadata standards for asset management, and that was a hell of a job trying to work that out, and I don't think we got anywhere. good luck, I think, but they would be very, very useful if they do come in. There will be fines for individuals and organisations that don't comply with information disclosure requirements. And Te Mana o Te Wai is being effectively removed in terms of the references in the Taumata ROI legislation. And there is a direction to Taumata ROI to have a regulatory response that's proportionate to the scale, complexity and risk profile of each drinking water supply. Again, given the size of Invercargill, I don't expect that's likely to significantly change the way that Taumata ROI deal with Invercargill.
Tom?
Is it the case that the new regulations would only apply when you renew your licence, or will they apply to existing plants?
My understanding would be that it's when you renew, you go for a consent renewal.
Right.
With the exception of drinking water standards and regulations that apply across the board already, but I believe you're meeting most of those already. So,
Yeah, we are.
Thank you.
funding and financing. This is more about the future system looking a bit different. So there will be a requirement for almost total financial separation from council finances, including dedicated financial statements and annual reports. And balance sheet information for water services, so it's a different set of reporting to what we are used to. It's just an additional administrative task, effectively. And there'll be a new water services strategy, but that largely replaces an LTP and an infrastructure strategy for water services. So we already collect most of that information and report on most of that information to our community already. It's just going to be in its own document now. With a little bit more rigour and a little bit of a slightly different focus, but it's not necessarily a huge replacement of what's going on there. And there are new debt limits for council-owned water CCOs, and this was critical to the Otago Southland work that we've done, but as any amalgamation, is that there's that 500% debt to revenue threshold that previously was a sticking point for any entity being viable. And I will touch on this a little bit more again further on. What I think is worth noting, of course, is that a water CCO will be able to borrow 500% broadly, and I can touch on that that's not actually 500%, but a water CCO will be able to borrow effectively 5 times its revenue under these arrangements, but it's of water revenue again, right? So it's 5 times your water revenue, so 5 times a third of council's revenue, which is lower than 2.8 times a whole of your council revenue. So you have to remember that moving water is not going to fix debt problems if you have debt problems in 3 waters necessarily.
Yeah.
It may.
So why the 5 times?
Sorry?
Why 5 times? Is there any
Why they've
methodology
come up with
behind
5 times? I don't know why they've come up with 5 times, but what I will say is that it's not actually 5 times. So what it actually is what we call a 10% FFO to debt ratio, probably.
Right, okay, yeah.
FFO being free funds from operation, or effectively your operating or your cash surplus from operations.
Yeah, right, yeah.
10% is from international credit rating agencies.
Yeah, right.
For regulated water utilities, so it is sort of set on something. When you translate that in statements, it comes out around 500%. So I don't know whether the 500% came first or the 10% FFO, but most likely the 10% FFO has, and they've just kind of translated that back to roughly 500%. So just to touch on the options of ownership and governance structure that are available to us to consider, and these are the ones that the DIA have published as part of their guidance for what's going to come in Bill 3. Bill 3 obviously not been out yet. The details around these are not as firmed up as what you'd think, but they're usually, these options are pretty self-explanatory, I think, anyhow, or at least are well described in the guidance the DIA has put out, and I can't imagine that that's going to change in Bill 3. And I've used the word CCO here, but the bill actually uses water services entity. It's just a special CCO so that they can have special rules that relate to a water services entity rather than rules that apply to a CCO. So we have an option for council just to continue to do it in-house with all that financial separation around it. That's your current status quo, if you will, without the financial separation. We can have a CCO, and in this case, the first slide I'm talking here is a wholly owned one, so that is just your council transferring all the stuff into a water services entity. Obviously, the critical arrangements around these water services entities is that they must have an independent board of directors that cannot include elected members on it. So that board of directors will be a board of directors that you are still able to determine who that board of directors might be, particularly if it's a wholly owned one. You'll have a reasonable amount of control on who is in on it, but that board of directors will be independent and should reflect, and I think it needs to be professionally qualified as well for the role.
And sorry, Stu, it can't be elected members or staff.
Or staff. Yeah. A joint CCO, effectively the same thing, but with multiple councils. So multiple councils are shareholders on this, and another water services entity. Most of the governance arrangements effectively just scaled up for the fact that you've got multiple councils participating in this. And then the last two options are potentially curveballs for most people, is that you can transfer all of these into a consumer trust. And you can either do that wholly, so you can transfer everything 100% into a consumer trust, and effectively from that day forth, council has got nothing to do with it. Or we can transfer them to a consumer trust or a water service entity that is half owned by a consumer trust and half owned by council. And the reason that these options are really there are around those communities that have electricity lines companies that are owned through consumer trusts, which I don't think is quite the arrangement with your electricity through PowerNet.
No, it is. It's half
It's half community trust, isn't it, at the end when you go
there's
through?
two separate entities.
Yeah,
The centre of the city is council owned
yeah.
through a CCO, but outside the city, including what we think of the city, but the kind of outside ring of the city is a consumer trust.
Yeah. So that arrangement is a little bit more complicated, and therefore you might not be looking at this. I would also note that obviously those last two options, well, particularly the one where you completely transfer it to consumer trust, is very permanent. A water services entity ultimately could be dissolved, albeit it might be quite challenging. Moving to a consumer trust is a little bit more difficult. And then for that consumer trust to then join with other water services entities in the future, should that be a decision that needs to be made in the future, may also be more difficult than it would be if it was just in a water services entity or a wholly owned one. So the main reason why people might want to do that is some of those consumer trusts have a really, really good relationship with their communities. They've already got processes in place to work with their communities and to get feedback from their communities. And some of them also may run systems that are similar enough to what you might need for water services that you can get economies of scope. Yep. So I'm going to take a breather, but that's the national context. I'm going to sort of zoom in a little bit down to the regional work, but we're not going to spend a lot of time dwelling on the regional work because this isn't a presentation of the Otago Southland regional work. But the regional work was commissioned, just to touch on it, was commissioned by the Otago Southland Local Water Done Well Working Group, which was instructed to be established by the mayors, I believe,
Mayoral
of Otago
Forum.
and Southland through the Mayoral Forum. And we undertook the work using the first principles approach, where we wanted to start right at the start of understanding the current issues and opportunities, determine what we thought success looked like, so that was setting out things like a strategic objectives and what we thought a Otago Southland Water Services entity should deliver for its combined regions. Then we explored options, undertook some analysis, some desktop analysis, some financial analysis, assessing those options, and then we put forward some recommendations in a report that I believe you've all had access to now, so hence I'm not going to spend a long time going through that. And some of that was presented in Balclooper, I think, 2 weeks ago now. But just to touch on what we did come up with there, and I'm going to point these out briefly in terms of what the regional objectives are. They're not necessarily the objectives we are suggesting should be adopted by Invercargill City Council, but I want to point these out because we think there probably ultimately will be some alignment with them, even though they may not be fully adopted. So the first one there was around delivering 3 water services in a way that reflects the importance of water to the health of residents, visitors, environment, and economy. That is really around compliance plus, is one way I might describe it. It's effectively saying we don't want to just be compliant with drinking water standards. We don't want to just be compliant with regulations. We actually want to make sure that we are respecting the importance of water and that we are actually, delivering healthy and safe and drinking water that is actually of a quality that we can be proud of. We also had a response here that is about sustainably responding to change in population, economic activity and climate change. You'll note we don't have the word growth there because we have recognised that some districts at times have not been dealing with growth and in fact have been dealing with decline. And we've also wanted to make sure that we're not specifically addressing just population growth here, because economic activity and economic growth is also equally important in some areas, and in fact some areas might be suffering, having stagnant population but a reasonable amount of economic growth, or vice versa. There was a desire to deliver 3 water services through a model that is responsive to the local needs of communities. So that's reflecting that local voice is important, that understanding what local needs are is important, and that we don't want a model that just responds to the loudest voice, effectively. There was also a desire to provide efficient and effective services through a model that supports robust decision making and the development of enduring capability and capacity. That is doing a lot of heavy lifting. So that one is talking about efficiency and effectiveness. It's also talking about governance and decision making at that governance level, and it is also talking about the capability of our staff and our workforce. But all of those things were considered important, and we have put them together because they all sort of work together and work in a way that fits together. And finally, almost straight out of the Water Services Delivery Plan legislation, a model that is enduring and financially sustainable. So I'm not going to dwell any more on those, but if we can keep them in the back of our mind when we get through what we think is important for Invercargill, because these are some of the things that obviously we've decided to be important at the Otago South level. And I think this slide is really important to present in terms of what an Otago Southland entity looks like and what that looks like for ratepayers. And critically, and we've made no apologies for this, and we certainly haven't tried to bury it in the report, that black line at the very bottom there is Invercargill, and the shaded blue area up above is where we think an entity's 3 waters household charges price might sit. So we are not trying to hide the fact that Invercargill is likely to have lower household charges on its own than it is through an Otago Southland Water Services entity. That doesn't mean you wouldn't make a decision to move to that entity, but you would need some compelling non-financial reasons to want to do that. Some very compelling non-financial reasons to want to do that.
So that's what the gap there is about $800, is it? Between the bottom of the blue.
Yeah, at
And
least $800. Yeah. Near Clark, sorry.
Yeah, so that works on the assumption that the shaded area, that everybody shares up the water levy. Uniform water levy, doesn't it?
Yeah, so that's, effectively that's the cost of the entity to provide its services.
Sure. Yep.
That doesn't mean that that's where the charges actually end up, and of course a water entity could spread the benefit of any efficiencies it achieves across all of its shareholder councils in a different way. The advice I've always given around this, though, is that while you may set it up like that, it'll be very difficult for it to maintain that, and I suspect that at a certain point in time in the future it would end up with the same price. Now, that doesn't mean it has to happen in year 1 or even in year 10, but we suspect that at some point in the future it would end up in that same price.
One of the models we're looking at, that's on the table, is that you have an entity, and you can borrow 500% to the water revenue, but the revenue comes at different rates from different councils. That's one of the models, isn't it? So Invercargill could pay $800 a year. Queenstown has currently got massive issues and debt servicing issues, might be twice that amount. But it comes into a central pool, but it doesn't mean that we're all paying the same rates or subsidising those areas that have already got no headroom.
Yeah, you absolutely could set up a whole pile of different ring fencing options around there. I have
Wasn't suggesting we do, but
no.
no.
You absolutely could. I mean, and my comment around that, my only comment around that, I think I mentioned in Balclutha, is that there is a risk when you start doing that you get to a point where you play whack-a-mole,
Yeah.
where we're trying to hit that problem on the head, but because we do that, another one pops up,
Yeah.
and then we hit another problem, trying to hit another problem on the head, and we can set it up as complicated or as simple as we want, but the more we try and start playing whack-a-mole, the more difficult it gets. And we've looked at this in Hawke's Bay. A good example of that is that when we first did this, there was a really clear concern around that debt transfer, with I think Hastings at the time having a lot of debt, KPA not having any debt. Now everything's changed in the 5 years or so since we first did that, but when we were doing that work, one thing we recognised early on is, well, yes, some people have debt, but the other people maybe haven't invested in their network at all.
Yeah, that's right.
And so they have actually got an infrastructure deficit, and we try to start looking at those two things as effectively the same. You're either coming in with an infrastructure deficit or debt. But as you started to play with it and come up with ways that you could deal with that in the pricing mechanism, no one could understand what it was trying to do anymore. And it's not just the people who are involved in working up that model, which may include the elected members at the table who might understand it with a lot of effort to get you on the journey, because it starts at the staff, and the staff figure it out and they know what's going on, but then we've got to explain it to you, and you're not as in the detail. But then we've got to explain it to the public, and it might have taken us 6 months to explain it to you, so good luck explaining it to the public in the time frame we want. So there is a risk that if we complicate things, it just gets so complicated no one can understand it.
Yeah. Tom?
Yeah, just so I understand that chart, in particular looking at the blue shaded area, as I understand the explanation for it now, I was on live stream, Balclutha, I never attended in person, but as I understand the blue shaded area, the bottom line is the bottom of the blue shaded area represents what we would aspire to achieve in terms of cost savings through the entity, and the top line represents what we realistically think might be, more achievable, if I can put it like that.
Yeah.
And am I right in thinking? Am I right in thinking that the range was it 17% or 15% or something was the best expected, and the other line is something like 7% or 8% performance improvement?
Broadly, so I guess I wouldn't have had a middle of the range if I didn't think the middle of the range was what we thought realistically could be achieved. So the middle of that range is where we think you realistically sit, but we recognise that no one knows how efficient an entity is going to be. No one actually knows how much it's going to cost to set it up until we have all the details around what that looks like. So the top of that range is actually what if the establishment costs were double what we think is a realistic and fair amount, and what if the efficiencies are only half what we think could be realistically achieved. The bottom is a 50% uplift in those efficiencies. So our base case is about 13% efficiencies for an Otago Southland entity. It hits 13%, it doesn't get any more than that, and it takes 10 years to get to 13%. So it's about 1% a year efficiency that it achieves.
And through the period, which is 30 years or something, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Through that period, the band is something like $500 wide on average. I mean, it varies a bit,
it does get quite
but
wide.
it's about $500. And if you look at the gap between it and the black line, so Invercargill can be between $500 and $1,000 better off on its own. And your $800 was kind of the average position of that, but it's sort of between 500 and 1,000 depending on.
So I think one of the most simple ways, and I'm getting right down to optioneering, which is probably the end of the slide deck, right? But one of the most simple ways to get some of the benefits from this entity in Invercargill without paying that full cost and without adding the complication is to contract the services of this entity from Invercargill. So you don't transfer all your assets across, you deal with that debt issue a different way, maybe by setting up your own CCO, but then you contract the services from this entity to be able to get some of those efficiencies. And that's a possible outcome that you could explore later on, but I don't want to get right down to the options at the end. But
Although, I'm sorry, but I know we'll get to it eventually, but in that situation, you'd expect that the entity would charge its setup, would include the cost of its setup costs and its charge-out rates.
Yeah,
It will be.
So you would, I
Cost
don't know,
recovery.
you just pay for it over a longer period, you
that's
still
right.
pay for it.
It might be a cost plus model, not just a cost model. Yes.
I think the only other thing I'd just note, just as a disclaimer, is that whenever DIA would be speaking to this, they've got very different views on how efficient an entity could be, and we saw that through the previous reform work, that they felt that Otago Southland combined would have a greater level of efficiency and therefore lower cost. I think a lot of councils didn't agree with that work and thought that it was very much more based on a European, much more dense population model. But I guess just in full transparency, I expect DIA would probably be a bit critical of this and expect greater efficiency out of an entity.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd take the advice of DIA around efficiency.
Well, and look, I would say, while yes, DIA may have a different view, it's worth noting that Castalia, who are one of the biggest critics of WIC's efficiencies assumptions, are now on the technical working group, or in fact chair the technical working group for DIA. And I think certainly speaking to some DIA officials, they've certainly softened on quite the extent to which efficiencies exist. What we're also trying to demonstrate with that blue band is, yeah, one end of that is effectively 50% higher efficiencies and one is half the efficiencies and double the costs. That model is not dependent on the efficiencies, right? The efficiencies are what you would be looking for if you were contracting services from it, but they're not. The model itself is not entirely dependent on efficiencies.
The other thing with this is that the assumption here is that all councils have got their long-term plans, right, haven't they? Did they all have 30-year infrastructure plans?
Yeah, so there's varying degrees of quality.
Yeah. I think they're
from
all over
year
that.
11 out particularly. So
Yeah.
some councils, all had infrastructure strategies, but some of those infrastructure strategies
very
kind
light.
of say we're going to do $500 a year from year 11 onwards,
Yeah.
500,000.
So you've used what they've said
But
to,
we've taken what they've said largely. We have put a bit of a critical line over the top of it, but we haven't spent a lot of time
Yeah.
redefining what the infrastructure strategies or LTPs look like.
and so the law of probability says that it's probably weak information, isn't it?
So this is probably, I guess the key of this slide actually though, is this is why it's really important for you guys to make your own decision, because that Otago Southland solution is probably unlikely to be the solution for you. And I don't want to make that decision for you because you guys need to make that decision, but you need to explore your options. And I think that this graph on its own probably tells you that you need to explore those options at least.
I think, sorry through you, Chair, I think it's important to remember too that it's not a kind of one-off choice. I mean, you can at any point apply to join,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
so things like, you know, if it became really, really efficient, suppose it was a 30% saving and it started to become attractive, you could join at that point.
Yeah, I would say, and obviously that's a decision that needs to be made further on when if that entity does get stood up. In Wellington, the Wellington regional councils that were considering that decision were told that if they opt out now, they can't come back in for 5 years. 5 years is not a very long amount of time when you consider it's going to take you almost 2 of those to get the entity stood up properly. So anyhow,
And sorry, I just want to reiterate the point that Councillor Campbell made, in that I think, you know, we've got a tight timeline to make a decision. The decision that we make doesn't need to be the last step on the journey. It can be a first step to where, you know, the journey may end somewhere else in the future. Absolutely.
right. Still conscious I've got a lot I want to get out of you, and fortunately you guys have warmed up. So one of the exercises I had there around what makes Invercargill great probably is less important because that was partly a warm-up, but you guys are well into it. So what I want to take you through today is just, and Erin's touched on this anyhow, is some of the steps of making it a good decision, and we're just wanting to get really right at the start is what is important from you, right? So to make a really good decision at the start, we need to know what is important to us and what is the most important stuff to us that will then help us inform where other options come in. As we move through that process, and most of this isn't for today, we want to look at options with an open mind. And we want to be comparing back to the status quo because that's the thing we're familiar with. And then as we move on, we want to go through an analysis of options, which again is not for today, but we'll go through that in a qualitative and quantitative perspective. Quick current state overview, just some key facts and figures that you're all probably really familiar with, having helped pull together and review and improve an LTP. Invercargill City Council has over $460 million of planned investment in its Three Waters network over the next 10 years. To fund that, we have Three Waters debt increasing almost eightfold on a per capita basis from about $440 today to $3,500 per capita by 2034. That number sounds really shocking. Eightfold is a much bigger increase than what we're presenting in Otago and Southland, but that end number, the 3,500, is a lot lower than what we had in Otago and Southland at a regional level.
So just a couple of things on that. So the 3.5 is amortised. So that's debt
Sorry,
repayment.
3.5.
3,500.
No, that's nominal number. So amortised in terms of paid over time.
So you're covering your costs.
Yep.
You're funding your renewals and you're paying your debt down.
The 3,500 is just your debt per capita. So it's not a bill.
It's your
Sorry.
debt, your
Yep.
per capita, right? Not your cost per capita.
Yep.
No.
Right. Okay.
Sorry, that's the debt. Yep.
Okay. You're right. Yep.
So by 2034, that
And
means
sorry, just speaking back to that cost one, the cost one is that second point around the
Yeah.
increase in bills.
I've got these in a funny order because I kind of like to talk about investment.
Percentages are nasty, aren't they? Because 77% of 10 cents is bugger all.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
77.
77% of $1,000 is a lot of money.
Yeah, and it's about 77%.
So
of
they'll
1,000.
they'll just under double.
And again, you're on the lower end of the spectrum for Otago and Southland there. And again, why you're at the black line at the bottom, right? So Invercargill's Three Waters debt to its Three Waters revenue will reach 390% by 2034. What that says is that you are borrowing more money for Three Waters than the Three Waters, you're over leveraging there effectively. And meanwhile, total council debt to revenue remains below 200% for all of the period that we've looked, for that 10-year period that we've looked at. And below 200% sounds really good. That's based on only the projects that are in your LTP outside of Three Waters or inside Three Waters, right? So Three Waters costs go up, then we might go over 200%. Also, if we want another big community thing, whatever that thing is, our total council debt to revenue may go over that 200% as well. So this is all based on current information, current LTP. But there's a reasonable amount of debt headroom in there. What that's telling me is there's no burning platform for you to get rid of your Three Waters debt off your balance sheet right now. And then just some contextual information around here. You've got an ageing population. Median age is increasing from 40 years to 45 years by 2048. And the relevance of that is is something that you need to consider when you're thinking about affordability, right? Because as people age and stop being part of the workforce, they are now reliant on pension or their savings that they've made for retirement. And so as water bills are going up, so too are potentially people more shifting towards fixed incomes. And you have the equal oldest Three Waters network in Otago and Southland. I haven't looked at this, how this compares nationally, but given the age of your city, in terms of Invercargill City and Dunedin City, which is the other equal oldest, being some of the oldest cities in New Zealand, I would expect that the age of your network is probably up there nationally. And the age of your network is driving the fact that you need to spend over $250 million on renewals over the next 10 years alone.
So is that in addition to the 459?
No, that's within the 450.
It's within the 459. Okay.
Most of the rest of that, I think, relates to your compliance upgrades for Clifton and Bluff
And alternative water.
and alternative water.
So that debt position of 3.5 per capita ends up at $37 a month to service per ratepayer. That's amortising it.
the slides, I think. Yep. So what I wanted to cover up here, though, is just understanding what is different about Invercargill, right? I want you to think about what makes Invercargill great, or what maybe doesn't make Invercargill great as well, because having to think about our city and what's going on in our city is going to be important to making sure that we can understand what is going to be important about Three Waters service delivery in the future for us as well. So I've put some starters up here. Is that we've got an increasing focus on industries that are dominant in Southland. So there might be quite a bit of economic growth coming your way. There's a lot of industrial development happening here. We may in the future be servicing industries that are actually located outside of our boundary. That's probably a strength because it gives us opportunity to get some more revenue from people that aren't necessarily our ratepayers. We're a regional service centre in town. I'd put it in the plus. It could probably sit in the somewhere in the middle. I've had to decide whether these are pros or cons, and some of them are just statements.
Or you want to get out of town alive.
It's a flat, easily serviced landscape, and that means that we've got lower pressure infrastructure. We get a leak, it doesn't create a brand new 20-foot fountain like I have in Wellington, where we don't have to spend so much money on public art because we get a new public art feature once a week. We have a compact Three Waters network as well here, which means that the cost to service on a per head basis is typically lower than it might be in the areas where we have a large network that's dispersed across a rural area. The downside of that, though, potentially is that we might have a whole pile of development and built up infrastructure, like vertical infrastructure, that sits on top of some really old pipes that might make them more expensive to fix. And Erin would probably understand that better than me as to how much that may or may not be a problem in Invercargill.
We definitely have some places where that's a problem.
And then on the downsides, though, we've got isolation making it hard for you to get specialists in, right? You're at the very bottom of the South Island. Our population centre is really in Auckland. And if it's not in Auckland, it's in Tauranga or Hamilton, and then maybe a few of us in Wellington and Christchurch. We have relatively low population growth, and we've got an ageing population that's going to impact on future affordability. And finally, we've got ageing infrastructure that will require ongoing renewal. Is there anything else that you think is contextually important about Invercargill that we need to understand before we start thinking about what future successful Three Waters service delivery might look like? Councillor Boyle.
Thank you. If we look at, say, ageing population impacting, what have you got there? Impacting future affordability. If we went down the line of meters, the ageing population would probably use less water.
Yep.
So that may be more towards the plus side as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It could move to,
Yep.
well, metering is a way of solving some of that problem potentially. Now, that's a really interesting observation, and Mayor Tim Cadogan at Central Otago has talked about that at Water New Zealand conference, about how that's exactly what they observed in Central Otago, but before they introduced them, it was the elderly population that were the most opposed to water meters.
Yes.
So again, communication, messaging, really important.
Yep.
We have a low debt profile.
Yep. Low debt profile. I think I've got Andrew actually amending my slides at the moment. I can't do it on.
We've got agriculture growth.
Agriculture growth?
Yeah.
And that was one of those ones that we identified as part of that national focus on industry that is strong in Southland. Yeah, absolutely.
We don't have a lot of intensity, so that can be a plus for us. So we can intensify our housing
Yeah.
without actually spreading our network.
Yeah, I think that's a good point in that we've got some capacity constraints in some areas of the network, but in general we've got good capacity across our network to allow for that intensification.
And good opportunities in terms of housing lots
Yeah.
to intensify.
The other thing we've got within the current network, we talked about growth up there before. Well, we don't have a lot of growth. It's very slow, but we've got about 1,500 spare sections in the city. So that's within the boundaries of the network, which is significant. So we can accommodate quite a bit of growth if we want to, without going into outlying new developments, which other cities have to do.
Tom?
Yeah, look, in terms of what's different about Invercargill, this probably applies to most places in reality, but I think when we think about the average city, then, you know, we miss the point that in reality there are wealthy areas of the city and there are significant areas of the city where rates increases would be unaffordable,
Yes.
right? So, you know, the kind of $400 that you described there, Grant, you know, for many people that would be manageable. And for other people it might be, you know, just completely unaffordable. So I think when we think about what kind of rates increase we can tolerate, particularly as we think about what model we might go into, as you think about what kind of rates increase we might be able to tolerate, we've really got to think about the, you know, those people who would struggle with it rather than those people who can afford it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, but the 400 is what do we take already off them? Because we might take 380, so it's only a $20 increase. Because we're taking ratepayer money. That's
Yeah, I was meaning if we're thinking about the entities. you
yeah.
know,
So I
something
wasn't
like
meaning the increase is 400. I'm saying the overall cost. So if we're taking 380 of revenue already off our Three Waters assets through our rating system, and the total cost is 440, then it's not a significant increase.
Very optimistic.
How much do we take off our Three Waters?
What it could go to.
I think positively for us, we have more infrastructure in place now than what we actually see with respect to our population. And I realise that we have issues in some areas where we are yet to put that in. So I think it's positive that we do have that, even though it's ageing in areas, we have good infrastructure.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because there's some positives in that we've got the ability to intensify, but we also have some satellite areas where we're not servicing as well.
Yeah. Can I just share that we don't have a lot of flatness in Bluff? We're low, with the low pressure.
Yeah.
You know, literally we've had problems up in Petrie Avenue, up top of Walker Street. You know, we've had multiple issues around pressure.
I think when Stu's talking more about pressure, what he's talking about is if you're constantly across your whole network pushing water uphill and then downhill, that makes your network have to work a lot harder than what it does if it's largely moving around a flat network. So absolutely there's some challenges in Bluff, not only around pressure but also around the rock. Every time we want to do something in Bluff, it's a bit of a nightmare. But that is reasonably a reasonably isolated problem compared to the broader network. Yeah.
Barry?
Yeah, we've got a situation where we've got residents out at Ototara that aren't supplied with our water supply. And if we put water meters in all places here, like Bluff and Invercargill, how will it affect their rates? Or is it they just going to be proportional to ours and we're just going to put everyone's rates up at the same time?
No, so don't receive a water charge if you don't have a water connection.
So
Yeah.
you don't contribute to the take.
I think it's a little bit different, though probably a bit more relevant to that with stormwater, in that all areas of the city currently pay a degree of stormwater charge. Whether you're connected or not, you pay more if you are connected. And so I think, you know, there are areas like Ototara, for example, where we have trouble with the fact that we don't have a lot of stormwater infrastructure in there, and that can cause us problems during heavier rain events as well.
You want to, yep.
Yeah, just around the water meters, I think it's a negative for us because while there's huge benefits of having them, a couple of things to consider. Central Otago put water meters in, and this is quite some time ago, about $10 million. They recovered it and saved water within 2 years. So that shows you how much savings can be made. But when the last government floated Three Waters to us, it showed us that over 10 years our water rates were around about $800, Three Waters, going up to about 2.5, depending on who you talk to, 2.5. So up about threefold. Auckland, in the same 10-year period, $800 going to $800. And you've got to ask yourself, why is that? They've got massive growth. key between the two cities is the water meters. And I think Tom raised the issue about we've got some low decile areas and some very high decile areas. So South City's decile 9, the worst being decile 10 in the country. And we often lose sight of that. The beauty of a water meter is the same as a power meter. You can control your costs if you want to.
Sorry, Stu, I'm just conscious that if
Yep.
we want to get to that prioritisation piece.
So we're not far from that. So I'm going to move us on to now you've had a time to think about what's important in Invercargill. I want to put up what's important for a future water service model. And I've just put a whole pile of concepts through the work that we've done around the country and heard from elected members all over the country around what they think may or may not be important conceptually, some values that you might want to imbue in your strategic objectives, or how you might want to start looking at models. So we've got affordability up there, and we've talked a bit about affordability already today. Service efficiency, environmental performance, and again, the way that we've described environmental performance here, we've already got compliance regulations and standards underneath that. So environmental performance is something over and above what is expected of the regulator in terms of environmental outcomes, okay? Service resilience. How important is it that we have a network that is resilient to drought, is resilient to low water take, or is resilient to natural disaster? Local presence. How important is it that it has a local presence, or there's local, and we've got local decision making on the other end? So local presence is more about it being here on the ground. Local decision making is the decisions are made locally or with locals in mind. Enabling economic and population growth, like I say, compliance, capability and capacity of the workforce, and again I touched before on the challenges we might have in terms of attracting workforces in the area that we're in. And finally, responsiveness of the entity. And I put one last one there with question marks on it because sometimes people have other ideas and we don't know what all of those ideas are. So what I'm going to do, hopefully you all have encountered these before, but if you haven't, I have got all of these on a Slido where I actually want to get your opinions here about your top 3 of those priorities. The way you do that is you just point your camera at that big QR code on there and it will hopefully tell you to open up a website. If that's not going to work for you, we have got paper and we can just note down your 3 preferred ones, and I'm happy to flick the slide back to the list if that's necessary for people. So yeah, I'll flick back to the other slide once.
No active poll.
Sorry. Anyone who wants to scan will scan, and then anyone who doesn't want to scan, we'll give you a piece of paper and you can write it. And the poll's not activated yet, is what I'm being told. That's my problem. 2 seconds.
When technology works.
Technology works, the consultant actually activates it. Yep.
Well, we wanted to just see how
think-
it worked with our current group.
That's what this is.
Oh, here we go. Yeah. In there.
Is it gone?
Yeah.
It should be up now.
Is that just beyond the basics? Oh yeah, we've got them.
Now, for anyone who wants paper,
We only choose 3.
does anyone want paper to write down?
Yep, top 3.
Only choose three.
Top 3.
I can't go backwards. Just okay.
We really need more
Oh,
than
sorry.
3.
Were you wanting to?
Nope, top 3.
That's not fair,
I know.
because it's really 4.
Just take it over, everybody.
Yeah. Do you know who did it?
Don't get me wrong, I really wanted 4 too.
I really want 4 because I feel like 4 is critical.
What we found is that it tended to come out anyway.
Well, if people come around can't, I figure out a way around it. Why can't they blend 2 questions together?
Cup. You can't do another bit on You've got to run with 3 horses and that's it. How'd you go?
Yes.
Come up with
Anyone else want
Has everybody who's using the QR code used the QR
I think
code?
we linked there.
I think we can switch back to the other page.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, I thought I had. Yep, sorry.
Switch back.
I think it's there. Yeah,
I'm done.
Oh,
That's okay, he's got it.
yeah, you got the QR code before I changed it. Oh, you've done?
I'm done. Except, yeah,
Three of these that you think are the most
Oh, right, okay. Yeah.
or
This is going to be interesting. So you're going to show us the results?
I will.
oh wow, that's interesting.
What'll be more
Affordability
interesting
is
is,
most important. Yeah, I'm looking at the stats now.
Yeah.
Affordability is number
Oh,
one,
yeah, there you go.
100%. Yeah.
Well, I just see it as a given.
Affordable, 100%.
Service efficiency, yeah, local decision
Local
making.
decision.
Once you've chosen, you might.
Okay.
That's bloody clever, isn't it?
Who's voted for I want a fourth choice?
Me, I want a fourth choice.
Who put other?
It's quite interesting when you see what comes through.
Three's not enough.
That's cool.
You can see your name on it. Your name's come through on what you voted for, Greg.
It has not. Is it? You're just kidding. It doesn't do that. It does not.
Yeah. I can't believe you voted that way.
I can't believe you voted that way. I
My
can't
three
believe,
votes, I
I
got the
can't,
first three
I
votes.
can't believe Barry voted that way.
Figure out how I can add these three.
The question is, has he or hasn't he spoken to Putin?
Eh?
Has he? He said he has. They're right. Did he tell him to sort of don't do anything silly? Is that what they were reported?
Oh, this is interesting. Yeah.
We should call our meetings.
Yeah, but one of the things that
Yeah.
did you watch Q&A on thing with Jack?
all keep in mind that our microphones are still live.
Okay. If everyone's done, I'll try and put the results up on the board. That will require me to share my screen. PowerPoint slideshow.
Have you passed?
I think, is that going to take over this one up the top?
Yeah,
On
it's
the
there.
side ones at least.
Sorry, Michelle, could you just move that screen over to the display?
Stu, will we get a copy of this, what we've done today?
Of the
Yeah.
presentation? Yep.
I'm a visual person.
Yep.
You just need to expand that, Michelle.
Thank you.
There you go.
Right. So, I think relatively unsurprisingly, I've got affordability being the number one option that people have chosen. Local decision making being the second most important. Service efficiency being the third most important, followed by environmental performance, service resilience, compliance with regulations and standards, and other, which I can scroll down, actually being next. So I've got one piece of paper here with an other that I've had to put in as other on the digital one, which is achieving planned delivery. I'd be interested in knowing what others people have put in. If anyone is willing, who voted for other, is willing to comment. Sorry?
No way to vote.
Well,
Yep.
I can. I ticked other. Because I think there's three things missing. Hang on. That
Yep.
I would have up there. One is the ability to recruit and retain water engineers.
Yep.
Two is the industry's ability going forward in the next 10 years to actually deliver what we
Yep.
collectively asked for, and that's a huge question mark. And so I think knowing those two things, and the other thing that we haven't discussed today, and it's just not discussed anywhere, is how we deal with stormwater. So we talk about three waters, but in fact we're really talking about two waters.
Yeah.
Because
And
the previous government said this is a very complex area. It'll take 3 to 5 years to develop, and so it's just gone away. So it's all right for us because we don't have intensity of housing here, and we tend not to have too many stormwater issues. But you saw what happened in Auckland. Intensity of housing, sloping land, just absolute mess.
and stormwater is something I've probably glossed over today, and partly because it's kind of a complication that we might want to deal with later, is that actually all this Three Waters, local water done well stuff, stormwater as to whether you move that over is still a decision you can make separately to what you move over into, effectively. And there are, I guess, pros and cons of either model for stormwater, with stormwater being very complex in terms of how it relates to transport and also how you might fund stormwater were it not in a council, because water services entities will not have the power to rate or to set a rate. And if you are if you live somewhere where you don't have a wastewater connection, you don't have a water connection, they can't turn off your stormwater connection.
And what I'd note, Mayor Clark, is I think from a staff perspective, we'd included those concerns around the capacity of the workforce and the capacity of the broader industry under that capability and capacity piece, which I agree is significant because it's very difficult to do any of those other ones around delivering an affordable service, delivering public health requirements, all of those sorts of things if you don't have enough of the right people.
So through you, Chair, for those that weren't here at the last triennium, the previous government did raise the issue of the industry's deliverability on this, and the major players in New Zealand were asked whether they could upscale to 100%, which is what's needed, and the response was we can do 20%. So that means that when we're considering CCOs, for argument's sake, we might be happy to get into bed with a CCO, say for argument's sake, an Otago Southern one. But if the priority of delivery is going to be in Queenstown and Dunedin, and the industry can't go any further than the workload that's produced by that, we could have as much planning as we like, but we just won't get stuff done. And the other issue is the issue of recruitment, and DIA gave a commitment 5 years ago, to try and encourage universities to take more students into the water engineering area, which is not a very sexy degree to have. They've done nothing, and my challenge is that we will probably have to do something ourselves, and there's an opportunity with iwi to do something, because iwi tell me that they've got an interest in water, and therefore we should be getting into bed with iwi and with ourselves and potentially with one of the government regulators to say, can we put together some packages that encourage people to go into that career path, I guess, because if we don't, we're going to end up with a brick wall somewhere along the line.
Stu, have they looked at from an industry perspective, why it's difficult for them to resource up? Have they leaned into that?
They certainly have surveyed what the industry would like to see in order to resource up, and a lot of it is around that long-term infrastructure pipeline information, which, you know, as an industry, I think is being worked on and is improving nationally. You know, and obviously I don't know that they mention this, but obviously the fewer people they have to deal with, probably the better for them as well. But certainly a lot of it was around that infrastructure planning pipeline stuff, right? Because you don't want to go and, I guess, bring over 200 migrant workers if you're not going to need them in 6 months' time, because suddenly the big project's finished and there's no other one.
And look, what I would say is that in fairness to the industry, as a local government sector, we're not very good at giving our contractors certainty of pipeline. Something changes either in our own local space or changes nationally. Elections happen, and then priorities change. And at the moment, the work that's happening around local water done well has meant that a significant portion of the country has put their Three Waters work on hold. And there are a lot of contractors now who are faced with the pressure of whether or not they lay off the staff that they have. That's a pretty, I think, dire situation for us to be in a country where we know we don't have enough of the right people, and yet we're considering whether we put people off. So absolutely that ability to get a good solid pipeline will be critical for us.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any others that they wanted to raise where they may have voted for other in that point and it's not captured? Going once, going twice. Yep, sold. Okay. So I did have an intention to put a 10-minute break in here so we could work on objectives, but given that as a group we have already tried to think about what the objectives might be for you, and given that we have 20 minutes left in this whole session, I'm going to suggest I put them up, and then you guys can just throw your insults at me about what we've done and how we've misinterpreted what you've got. And that's what I'm here for, because you get the consultant in to be the wrecking ball, right? This is what we think, or we thought was important to you. And if you think back to the Otago Southland ones, they are a bit different, but thematically we still get to the same themes largely. So you'll note, and we see that affordability was the number one priority there. We've stuck the word affordable back into that objective at the bottom there. So the financial one there is ensure three waters are enduring, affordable and financially sustainable. We're bringing affordability back to the forefront of our objectives. It is at the bottom there, but in terms of priorities, if we were going to take this and weight those objectives, obviously that bottom objective would have a higher weighting. I'm not a huge fan on how I've ended up with the wording of that first objective, but effectively that is saying meeting regulatory compliance. We haven't actually gone as far as saying environmental performance in this one. So we're not saying compliance plus, and I think that might be something I've seen in today's stuff that maybe needs to move up a little bit more, is actually we might want to do more. I don't know if that's what I heard from you all there.
Well,
that comes at cost, obviously.
It does, and that's the issue. If you talk to the regulator, which I did last week, they said on the wastewater, so it'll be no different for this perspective as well. A standard is a standard. If you meet it, you meet it. Why would you go to a higher standard and keep evolving environmental outcomes if it comes at a significant cost? And that's the affordability issue that you had at 75%.
Yeah.
Because that'll be the bottom line with ratepayers, I guess.
Trish?
I think also, I don't see reflected there about local decision making. You're talking about local needs. But I think I personally think it's quite important that it is local decision making.
Yeah, so we tried to, and so we could certainly amend that a little bit. So we tried to reflect that through a decision-making model that reflects the local needs, but you're right, that doesn't mean the decisions are being made locally.
No, that's what, I don't know, I just feel that was quite strong.
Yep.
What I'd say is, in reflection on that, we spent a little bit of time on this when we were trying to think about, as staff, what would be important. There's definitely some councils that have very much gone through this process and said local control is imperative. When we did this, we got the impression, and we may have been wrong, that it's more around reflecting being responsive to the local need. It didn't matter as much where the decision was made, as long as it was the right decision locally. But we may have gotten that balance wrong.
Possibly, excuse me if I can, possibly the inference is that if it does reflect the local needs, it is done by the local people, decision makers. Yeah.
It most likely would have to be, I
Yes.
think, but there's no. There is an inference, and we can be more explicit if there was a desire to be more
I would
explicit.
support that as well. A lot of the time we hear a lot about the intergenerational asset, and that retaining the local focus and the local ownership has been at the forefront of the community ever since we've started the conversation, or the government started the conversation about free waters. It's just evolved to this point of it now.
Pani?
I think I don't think we're strong enough really.
Can you use the mic, please?
I don't think we're really strong enough around providing efficient and effective type services. I just think we've sort of glossed over it.
Yeah, and we slightly glossed over that because we part of that I think is around, I guess, if you achieve some of these, you have to do that. Yeah. So there's kind of a little bit of a to do one, you have to do the other a little bit here. So if you build and develop a strong and capable local three waters workforce, you would expect that you will have effective services, but there's no guarantee.
But what about the infrastructure? I mean, that as well. I mean, yes, the workforce, but also the infrastructure itself.
No, exactly. Well, and look, quite happy to try and reflect that better in some of these options as well. That's what they're up here for, right? Is to have you throw comments at me and us to be able to refine them. And the other point around the efficient, obviously, is that to get affordable and financially sustainable, we would expect efficiency would have to, you would almost need efficiency to achieve that.
Alex?
I guess just to that point really, that we all had affordability at the top of our, well not all of us, but many of us had affordability at the top of our list there, as demonstrated by the graph. But if you think wider about the community, I don't think anybody cares about how affordable it is if it isn't safe to drink, or if it is, or if it's going to damage the environment to that degree. So, like to your point, Stu, I think it's really important that one comes together, and that safe drinking water is definitely always the top outcome.
That survey is still live, I think, if you're wanting to change it.
Safe drinking water should definitely be
Yeah,
at the top
but-
of that.
But I think
And look, we may have not been quite explicit enough in that, and that we didn't give you safe drinking water, we gave you legislative compliance, one of which is safe drinking water. So.
The efficiency ones, the efficiency ones
It's the bare minimum.
that Parne's raised is a good one, because it's hard to see where it reflects through those objectives.
yeah, no, it's not clearly in there. I agree.
One quite easily.
Yeah, and to me, it's got to be a real strong tenor of what you do, because if it's not efficient, then you're not affordable, are you? And if it's not efficient environmentally, then you're not sustainable.
Yeah, and I think actually it was in one of the Otago Southland ones, and I think we might have replaced it with the best practice infrastructure management piece here, but we can simply switch it back to the effective and efficient.
Yeah, we did. We replaced that. I think
And the
Andrew
other-
is
the
still
other-
going away putting comments against this stuff.
The other thing would be, is it the priority of, let's call it this entity, to develop a strong, capable local Three Waters workforce? I would have said, if you get some of the things right around enabling that, that will happen.
Yeah.
But is it your responsibility? So if you get your contracts right and your tenure right of those contracts, you will enable a strong workforce, because there'll be sustainability there. But is it actually a focus of this entity? The contract would be, but not the workforce necessarily, would be a challenge I'd put out there. Because they're not your staff, they're contractors to you, right?
Yeah.
That's the model you're using.
Well, they could be your staff. There's no. We certainly haven't suggested that your model has to include contractors, although you probably inevitably use contractors to some degree. But there are certainly councils that do almost everything through their own staff,
Right.
with the exception of maybe
I
some of the
think-
stuff that you do actually do.
Yeah, well, I'll be really honest, because this is one that's probably most important
Yeah.
for me as an infrastructure manager. The difficulty that we have is that when we're looking at, to Mayor Clark's point, we'd love to have some additional cadets that are on, so we can start to build some of that capability, so that we're able to deal with the fact that we've got some staff who have been working in their roles for the past 40 years, and the experience they have is amazing. But when we're so constrained within the organisational priorities of all those different competing things, the ability to have somebody who's sitting in the wings and learning, we simply don't have that headroom to be able to do that. So what is a model that provides us the ability to invest in training and growth and development of our people? And to be honest, that's really, really difficult to do under our current model. Are there some other ways that we could look to make that better for us, and also better for the industry in general? Because we want to be putting some people out there into the industry, and hopefully we want to be bringing some people in from elsewhere as well.
Leslie?
I think if you don't have that one in, the risk you run is that you don't end up delivering efficiency or safe drinking water or the services that we are aiming to do. I think it's actually a big part of this whole approach to have that in there as part of the investment objectives. Because if we don't treat it seriously, then we will constantly be on the back foot with the
You essentially
constantly to
compromise the
recruit
other pieces.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I suppose
We
it's
constantly need to use more contractors than we should for efficiency's sake. So I think it's actually a really important one to have in there as a very upfront thing.
Yeah, I suppose it's how you scale, whether you choose to scale your workforce, isn't it? If you have it as a planning sort of thing, or you
It
have it
needs
as,
to be there as a planning tool, and yeah, if it
Yeah.
includes something like Aaron's talked about cadetships and so forth.
Yeah,
then
yeah.
But I
that's
think we'd
something
also
for the-
note that this is about more than just the staff who are hired by council. It's about the fact that there's not enough capability in our contracting
No, that's right,
markets
yeah.
as well. And, you know, we're starting to see some of those bids that come through where there's value being put on companies that do that similar investment in staff training and development and things like that. How do we do those things differently?
yeah. Tom and then Trish.
I just wanted to comment on the third one down, in particular the words, a decision-making model that reflects the local needs of our communities. And it's worth just reflecting that the option of a CCO, whether it's a combined CCO or an individual CCO, significantly reduces the ability of communities to influence what happens. They have no requirement to consult. If you want an analogy, if you think about what happened when PowerNet decided to run the transmission line from Finlay Road through to Open Country Dairy, there was no consultation whatsoever. You know, they just appeared. Well, they never haven't appeared yet, but the poll showing where they were going to appear appeared. So CCOs, whether it's a local CCO or a regional CCO, a CCO very substantially reduces the community say in what happens. So if you transfer that to if you think about that, saying that the Bluff wastewater context, they would just design something and build it. There would be no consultation. You know, I mean, we've agonised over it, but there'd be none at all with a CCO. At least they would not have to. I mean, they might choose to, but they would not have to. So I think when we use those words, reflect the local needs, just remember that even if a CCO is local, it still does not necessarily reflect community needs. They don't have to consult.
Well, perhaps that's why it says through a decision-making model, etc., which means that we have to deeply think about the actual model we choose.
Exactly.
And
Well,
perhaps
that was the point.
That's a point against the CCO.
Yep.
Trish, did you want to?
Just for clarity, the way I think, it would be good to have those objectives written down and perhaps the 11 bullet points we had across the top, and even across
Line
as
them
to
up.
how they align,
Yep.
just so that we can see what is missing or where they fit.
A little bit of a tick cross thing.
Yeah, I don't know, I just thinking about that.
Cool.
I'm also conscious that I've got 5 minutes left of your time, and this slide looks like it's got a lot on it, but it doesn't have as much, I don't think. All I want to show here, and this is really simplified, but these are the options that we think are available to you to consider going forward for a water services delivery model, and I'll read it out because the writing is quite small. So at the top there we have a ring-fenced in-house unit, right? So it's largely what you're doing now with with largely the main changes being sticking some ring fencing around it. The next one is a ring fence unit with some structural change. So that might be that we actually change, there might be some organisational design things that need to happen to be able to actually more physically ring fence it. It might be that we set up a 3 water subcommittee that maybe potentially even has independent members on it. There are a range of different things you could do there to still have an in-house option that has some different governance decision-making elements over the top. Next I put shared services arrangement, and in this one I have included a management CCO, which might also be where you might contract from an Otago Southland entity if that were there. Obviously by the very nature of the word shared in there, that implies that there is someone else also at the table with us in that shared services arrangement. So that would be working with one of our neighbouring councils most likely, but it doesn't have to be neighbouring. And that could be of varying sophistication from joint contracts right through to that kind of management CCO type option. Then we've got a wholly owned CCO, or water services entity. I think I described that earlier on, but that would be one wholly owned by Invercargill City Council, so you're not working with anyone else under that arrangement. Otago Southland water services entity, a Southland only water services entity, so that's Southland Invercargill and Gore, most likely. And finally, partly or fully owned by a community trust, which I've stuck down the bottom there because that is probably the most change that you could possibly do in terms of its permanency, at least. And then I've reflected some of the things, the pros and cons there, if we wanted to discuss them. But is there anything in there that stands out as we wouldn't even bother considering that?
Can I ask, sorry, Mr. Chair?
Yep.
Can I ask a question? With your last entry up there, and you discussed briefly about the option being a more permanent one, so is there no way, if we decide actually this isn't not working for us, we need to come back out and move over to like a standalone CCO?
So
Once you do that, there's no going back?
Once it's
is
in a
there?
community trust and all the shares in that entity are owned by the community trust, you have no longer have any ownership of them. So you have no recourse. The community
I
trust,
don't like that one then.
the community trust, and therefore the consumers, which are usually the consumers of that trust, could theoretically vote to send them back up. Maybe the community trust may have rules in it around its trust deed, around dissolution of the trust and how that might be dissolved, but it would be considerably more complicated.
Yeah, I consider that bottom one, we should take it right out.
And from what I can gather, again, Invercargill City, including Bluff, as a constituent area, territorial authorities, you don't have an obvious consumer trust that you would transfer it to anyhow. Because you wouldn't probably transfer it to a licensing trust. I wouldn't have thought.
Also doesn't cover
If
the
you're
whole
at,
area.
I'm
Tom,
sorry,
yeah.
I was just going to say, you did ask us if there's anything that we would take off the table.
Yep.
I mean, my personal view, you would take the trust off the table at this stage.
Yeah.
You could eventually actually move to that at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's
As
no reason you can't later. Yep.
You know, it's happened with the Per Trust, you know, and that was not that developed over time. But I would personally take the Otago Southland CCO off the table. I think it's just too expensive. You know, there is at no point over the next 30 years is there any point where it becomes less expensive than doing it ourselves. So I would personally take it off the table. I think all of the others could remain on the table. I note the Southland only CCO, which I had personally favoured, but I think, as you say, your neighbours' costs are significant, and the only way you could do it is probably a management CCO rather than anything that shared the debt.
Some
But-
kind of shared services.
A shared service, yeah.
Whatever
the
form that
management
takes.
CCO.
Yeah.
But I would personally take the Otago Southland off the table. I just don't see any way we could make it work.
In the Southland CCO, to your point, Deputy Mayor, the neighbours' costs are significant, but can they not be ring-fenced in that same manner?
Sorry, say again, you're
Can
way
they,
too
sorry,
far.
can they not be ring-fenced in that same manner as the?
Yeah, they could.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, that's an alternative way of doing it. So you could have an ownership CCO, but with ring-fenced debt.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if Southland or Gore said to us they were interested in that, then we should be interested too. But if you look at what happens to them in the Southland Otago CCO, it's difficult to see why they'd want it. In the combined entity,
Yeah.
they're the biggest winners, actually.
Yeah, indeed.
So to that effect, we will be asking just some questions at a staff level for direction from our various different chief executives and councils as to whether they want to explore a Southland option. So that's something that we could do. What I would say around the Otago Southland option is that I think we'll always come under some degree of criticism for why we haven't considered doing that. The only thing I would say is that I personally don't think that's a bad option to show the community as being one of the options to consult on, because I think it would be a very clear no. And I think that it gives us a very good case for why we haven't done that. But that would just be my 2 cents worth.
I think, Erin, another reason for showing that as an alternative is that we have all of the numbers, right?
It's
so
very
we don't
easy.
have, and we don't have numbers for anything else, for any other kind of entity.
Yeah.
So you don't have to redo the whole thing.
Yeah, and so look, I guess what our intention was to basically any of those ones that we didn't already have numbers for that council was interested in, we'd go away and take the work that Stu's already done and run some numbers on these other options. So that was intended to be the next sort of those next steps to come back.
I'm sorry, through you again, Chair. When I said that I would take it off the table, I did not mean that I would not have it as the alternative, because it is clearly the one where we could show it as an alternative today, because we've got all of the numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no harm in having something the public's going to dislike. You know that's what,
Yeah.
control the narrative.
So, look, I don't want to make assumptions. I want to be, what we do, I think, just need some guidance from council is, do we want to go and do some modelling on these other options, or do we want to simply say we've got some status quo information, which we've said we're going to do some more work around just the risk tolerance of that. We've got the Otago Southland options. Do we want to explore a council-only CCO and what that might look like?
So given there's a whole lot of variables still to come, I think working on any other option at this point is not a good use of resource.
Yeah.
But you would,
Not to say
you could get to a point
when the rules change.
But just noting, you're not going to have that certainty before you have to publicly consult, so it's the
yeah.
question of what you want to publicly consult on. Chair,
I think, Chair,
yeah.
we'll, to some extent, we'd be in a better position at the second workshop to answer that question.
And the really difficult part with this is the timeline we're on. We need to do that work for you between now and that workshop. Otherwise, you won't be in a position to make a decision early in the new year.
So how much do you think you could usefully produce by the second workshop if we asked you to work on an in-house unit and a wholly owned CCO?
yeah, I think we've got to give a couple of other options, haven't we, if we're going to do work.
Are we going, is that
Yeah,
giving
so
you
we
enough time
would
for
do the
useful
financial
information?
modelling for that ahead of the next workshop. Yeah.
Yeah, having just spoken in one direction and given some of the conversations that are going on, would people be asking about a Southland-owned CCO? And some work in
Given
that
there's
area.
already some discussion around a Southland Unitary Authority, I think there would
Two
definitely be
Southland
some, yes, true, two Southland Unitary Authorities. There would probably be I guess for me it's the piece around defensibility, particularly later on when people say, why didn't you consider that? Why didn't you consider
Yeah.
this? Have we actually got some robust reasons where we've gone through all of the main options, done some robust work around it and said, look, this is the best option for us?
So which options you would go, you've got the Otago Southland, you do,
You do your Otago Southland,
Well, you've
we
got
do a
that.
slight tidy up on the status quo. I think a council-only CCO, and if there is some interest out of the other Southland councils, a Southland CCO, but I don't know that that's very valuable if there isn't any interest out of the other Southland councils.
I think it would be essential to sound out
And
the other
council.
Southland councils. If there's no interest,
yeah, why would you model it? Yeah.
then we've got the answer that could be a public answer.
So your status quo would be your ring-fenced,
Would your status quo include those two? So
Yeah.
the ring fence in-house and looking at some minor structural change.
that,
Yeah,
that's what
do
that,
that.
we could
combination.
come back around how we would implement that.
are we happy with that then?
Seems sensible.
Okay, so ask around the CCO, the Southland. If there's no interest, we don't do it. Otherwise, we model up, we've got the Otago Southland, we model up a wholly owned CCO and we do a current sort of ring-fenced unit, some structural
Some
change.
structural change.
Yeah, okay. Does that give you good direction?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Is it about this or?
Yeah, absolutely. So,
And I'm just conscious our governance team will be wanting to switch over, so
Yeah.
we'll be in
so
trouble.
having sat in this three water stuff for about 5 years now, I think the outcome that we want to achieve is standalone, with a shared agreement that looks at procurement, economy of water engineers and planning skills, and we've lost sight of who they might actually come. So we could have a shared agreement with Dunedin, another big city that's going to have a lot of procurement. Getting into bed with Gore, big question mark over that. The priorities of a CCO get beyond our control. So one of the things we're getting into bed with the other councils is the directors of that CCO will then decide where the priorities are. So
Yeah, yeah.
give you the worst example is getting into bed with Queenstown.
So in the modelling of those different entities, you present some sort of challenges or risks as part of that.
Yeah, so what we'd essentially do is, and Stu, correct me if I'm wrong, we'd essentially we'll take away those changes to the objectives, and what we'll do is we'll tidy that up to reflect those different priorities that you've asked us for. We'll then do some modelling of those numbers, and we'll bring you back essentially a red, amber, green status against each of those objectives for each of those different options.
Yeah.
What's red, what's sort of neutral, amber, what's green, yes, that really works.
Yeah.
So just through you, Chair, so the two big issues we decided on today were affordability and local decision making. How do we get that when we get into a CCO? It's a
And
big
so I
question.
think what we'd find is that reflected
So if we
through our
want,
scoring.
So that's what the scoring.
if we're honest with ourselves and we
Surely
want
that's
to
gonna be answered
we
by
want
the
to stand
scoring.
alone, then what's the second option that we need to take to the community? So do we take something that's a CCO just for us, and maybe others will join, that opens up a whole lot of question marks for people that we're going to consult with, or do we take something that we think is really ludicrous at the other end, so we give them the Clayton's option? And some people will see through that. And so that's where we're going to get a bit, I think we get a bit stuck, because I think,
we're
I
not
don't speak for myself, but I
we're
think
not
we
at
know
that.
we've got one option, why do we throw others
We're
up?
not at that point where we've decided what we're going to take to consultation yet. What we're trying to formulate up is, okay, what are the options? What do they look like for us? And then we will formulate, okay, this is what we're going to take to consultation.
And I think it's key that we have to take at least two, but we can take more than two.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the dilemma is that we're going to firm up Otago Southland. Look, I can tell you that none of the Southland mayors agree with Otago Southland. I can tell you the Dunedin mayor doesn't agree with Otago Southland, but they won't say that publicly because everybody wants to be part of the coalition
It
of the
is now.
willing.
It is
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, so,
Well,
so
it doesn't matter.
but what's your concern by taking the Otago Southland model through? It's a Clayton's
Well,
option.
If, for argument's sake, we couldn't stand alone and we had to look to a CCO model, would anybody around this table be happy with Otago Southland?
No.
Given that the
No.
big priority needs in Otago Southland are Queenstown, Lakes District, and South City, Dunedin.
Yeah.
We will never get the work done, given that the industry
Yeah.
hasn't upscaled yet. We'll never get the work done. Doesn't matter how much money we put into our long-term plan.
Yeah,
We
no,
won't
but
get the work done.
what's your objection to taking the Otago Southland model through to consultation?
Well, I wouldn't even go down the line of an Otago Southland
It's
model.
not financially suitable for us.
So that's okay. So again, we can make some decisions later on. We don't necessarily have to consult on them. I think it's still sensible for us to score them so that we can show, the
Yeah.
pros and the cons.
Yeah, I think.
All we've said at the moment is leave that one in for the scoring. We already have the data, there's nothing more staff need to do, but it needs to be there, because if it's not there, we will immediately be questioned on why we eliminated it so early.
Yeah, and to that point, this is sort of what the government sort of directed us to do, isn't it? To
Exactly.
do it, we want to see a regional model. So if we discard it, are we given the
It
two-fingered
looks
salute to
very
that process?
cavalier. We discarded at this stage,
Yeah.
when the work is effectively done.
Yeah, but I think to your point, Mayor Clark, is we've got to highlight the issues or challenges we see with those different models, right? Because we've got to present our preferred option, haven't we?
I think one issue we should remember too, though, is that the other option that we present, assuming status quo is one, the other option that we present is going to have to be sort of fully costed and worked up in advance of consultation. And we're not that long away from that, given...
No, that's right.
Right, so we don't have a lot of time to work, say, a Southland model up to a level where we could actually take it to public consultation.
Yeah, that's right.
So, I mean, the bookends we've got all of the data for the Otago Southland model. We've got all of the data for pretty much for the standalone model. If we wanted to present a third, say, then we probably could present a standalone CCO model, because the only cost really you've got to add into that is the governance cost.
Yeah.
Set-up cost, governance cost, you might assume some, small saving, but there's not a huge amount of work involved in it, so you could probably do that.
Yeah.
And look, I think the key thing is that Morrison will already have all of the data in the background.
Yep.
It's just a matter of us now cutting the data which way we want to look at it.
Tony gets the last word.
I just want to take on board on what Tom said around CCEOs and the logistics. I think what would be really helpful, and because we seem to go backwards and forwards on this, is actually look at the pros and the cons as you talked about earlier, and so that we're fully informed.
Yeah.
Because I get nervous because they do have a lot of power, and they can change the rules without consulting.
CCO, holy CCOs. Yeah, like the padding thing, yeah. No, all good. Righty-ho, I think we're done.
Done. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks very much, Stuart.
Thank you.